If we kept our children home every single time they had a bit of a runny nose, let's face it, they'd probably never go to daycare and never go to school. So what should we be doing? When should we be keeping them at home? When is it okay to send them back to school? It can be so confusing as for parents. Thank you for joining us today for Mother Doctor Nurse, or Doctor Mother Nurse, or Nurse Mother Doctor. When we go through common childhood problems and first aid issues to help you as parents and caregivers safely care for your children. For those of you who haven't met us, my name is Dr. Deb Levy. I am a paediatrician, and I am joined by the wonderful Sarah Hunstead, a paediatric nurse and founder of CPR Kids. Thanks everyone for joining us. As always, type a quick hello. Let us know where you're tuning in from if you're watching this live. And again, if you are watching this live, I'm happy to answer some questions at the end, bearing in mind I can't give any personal medical advice. So Sarah.
Well, I tell you what, this is something that I think that every person just absolutely thinks about. And, remember, we're coming to you live from Sydney, Australia, so Gadigal and Bidjigal land. But often there are a lot of people tuning in from other places around the world. So the resources that we're talking about today that we will talk about at the end are Australian based, but please make sure that you know what's available for your country as well. So, Deb, where do you want to start with this? I think what you said with the snotty noses is a big one, because we absolutely know that snotty noses are going to happen, 12 times a year. It feels like 40 times a year at the moment. So where do you want to start? Do you want to talk about that and talk about when do you actually need to keep your kid home when they've got a snotty nose?
Look, I think that when do you need to keep your kid at home, the kind of the easy group to know the answer to is your child if they're unwell in themselves. So we're talking about a child who's, not their normal self, not as energetic, or they have a high fever, not eating, feeding, etc. So, that group of children, whether or not they have a snotty nose, is the group of children that get to stay at home and get to see their healthcare provider.
There's one thing there that you just highlighted, which I think is just so important, and that is if your child's got a fever, that you need to keep them at home. There's no two ways about that, because obviously they're fighting off some kind of infection. But one thing that I'm going to ask you a question now. I know you've probably got a lot more to talk about this, but this is, and I always hear myself say, this is one of the biggest questions we get asked at CPR Kids. But this seriously is one of the biggest questions. And that is, well, if my child's had a fever, all night, they wake up in the morning, I give them some paracetamol or some ibuprofen and their fever goes, can I send them to daycare then?
I'm chuckling because I know that for some parents, it really is tricky to have a sick child, if they have to work, if they've got other responsibilities. But bottom line is, if you are giving, whether it's paracetamol, acetaminophen for our watcher in Tennessee, or ibuprofen, that's going to mask a fever. It's still actually there. Chances are you are going to get a call in a couple of hours' time, if not sooner, when that fever spikes up again, or your child is obviously unwell. So, unfortunately, it doesn't. And, my rule of thumb, which I guess is what we're going to come to in this talk as well, is at least 24 hours without a fever is one of the things I look for in terms of being ready to go back to, whether it's preschool or school.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, so do you want to elaborate a little bit more about those signs, about, the clear-cut signs? Can you recap those again? And then what about some signs that might not be as clear-cut?
So any of the worrying signs that we talk about, in terms of alerts or red flags, sorry, is the word I was trying to get out, red flags, which is difficulty breathing, signs of dehydration, lethargies, extreme irritation, change in behavior. Those are our classic group of things that we look for. there are also other things that can be concerning in terms of rashes, which we're not going to dive into today. I'm happy to talk about that, but I know we've also done a few other talks on that in terms of which are the more dangerous and worrying rashes. And then again, fever, depending on the age of your child, and a whole other lot of symptoms. So, this is when we keep our child at home. In terms of other symptoms, I guess the other thing I want to talk about is a cough, because that's, between the snotty noses and the coughs, I feel that, especially now as we're battling through winter here in Australia, a lot of children are suffering from those two symptoms. And again, when is it okay to send our kids back to school? Excluding all of those symptoms I've chatted about, let's say your child has none of them and they've just got the snotty nose, I think, or they've just got that cough, I think that's when it becomes a little bit more tricky, Sarah. And, there are two ways to look at this. I'm presuming, of course, that, your child has been assessed by a healthcare provider and they don't have any underlying condition. But I guess I want to divide it, and I want to go, is this definitely an infection? Or is this an allergy, perhaps? Children can have a chronic snotty nose if they've got hay fever, and that can be quite tricky. And hay fever can cause a postnasal drip, which gives them that fruity, and by fruity, I mean like a wet sounding cough. And that can sometimes be a bit confusing in terms of, oh my goodness, is this another cold? And certainly your healthcare provider can help you with that diagnosis, but so can a symptom diary as well. And I think that can also be, it can also reveal quite a lot. In terms of a cough, we do get this phenomenon of like a post-viral cough or a post-viral bronchitis, where children can have a cough for weeks on end. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've got an infection, and it doesn't necessarily mean they need to stay home from daycare. So what would guide you? Absolutely, your doctor needs an assessment. Could they have underlying asthma or something also needs to be answered? Could it be something else like reflux? I mean, the causes of coughs is just, we're a large list. But if everything has been excluded and they've just got this, this tickly cough, or, this cough after having after having had a sleep, so they're lying down, usually those children are actually okay to go back to daycare.
And I mean, that's something that we're seeing more and more of now, that I know that certainly a lot of people who have had COVID, they're having a cough for weeks afterwards, and certainly the same for the kids too, even though, after we're out of our isolation, out of our exclusion periods and so on, but the coughs are lingering. And I think that one thing as well, if you are being questioned by daycare, about this, if it is lingering, then being able to get your GP, and this is why it's so important to have a good relationship with your GP, that you've seen them, they've got the all clear to go to school, get your GP to write that certificate that says that they are all clear, and then that sorts that out as well. I think that's an important thing.
Absolutely. I think the other thing to note, obviously the causes of cough, I've touched on that and I'm not going to go into. I guess the other thing to note with a snotty nose is, I've mentioned the two major ones, allergies and infections, but and especially this is if your child has got one snotty nose, always think there could also be a foreign body there. So, the classic picture is, green mucus from one nostril. And that would certainly make me suspicious. And I'm sure, Sarah, you've got a story to tell about that. Right?
Oh, of course I do. Especially if that mucus smells as well. That's one of the things. So I always tell stories, but I have to tell this one again, of the child who was picking the foam out of his car seat and shoving it up his nostril. The first thing his mum noticed was this yellowy green snot coming out of his nose that was foul smelling. Thinking it's an infection, kept him home from daycare, but going, hang on a sec, he looks really well. Took him to the doctors, ended up finding that needed to have it removed. So it is one of those things where it's that, what you said before, Deb, I think is key as well. It's that input from your healthcare provider that lets you know that this is an infection, this is something that's different, and we are okay to be going back to daycare and so on. And I think that's one of the big questions that a lot of parents and carers have too is, well, okay, my child's had, a virus. they're, we've gone past the major symptoms, say gastro, for instance. So they've had the diarrhea and the vomiting. They stopped vomiting a couple of days ago, but the diarrhea is still going. Their stool's just a little bit worse. They're normal in themselves again. They're bouncing around, all the rest of it. They're drinking really well, but they've still got the squirts a little bit. Can we send them back, or do we need to keep them home until they got a normal poo? And how long?
Well, that's it, right? Look, I think, certainly the things we're going to cover today, the snots and the coughs, I think we've gone through quite well, vomiting and diarrhea, and just so we don't forget to cover it, rashes as well. Yes. The vomiting, I think that's pretty obvious, right? If your child is vomiting, they're going to be at home. Exactly. Yeah. The diarrhea one can be tricky, and it can be tricky because any child, any caregiver, parent who's listening to this who's had a child with a pretty bad bout of gastro will find that sometimes those poos can take weeks to go back to normal. So that can certainly be tricky, and often daycares will have a rule or a policy at least of having to be at least 48 hours symptom free from gastro symptoms before returning to school. And that just reminds me to always just check with your own daycare or school what their policy is around returning after having had an infectious illness, because they will all have policies. So I guess to answer your question, Sarah, is that it's tricky. It's tricky if their stools have improved, but they haven't totally gone back to normal. That is when I would be touching base with your healthcare provider. And I know that we keep on saying this, but that's because there's certain things, that you do definitely need their support with, because often what I will see after about a gastro is something called secondary lactose intolerance, where you get these runny poos when you're having dairy foods. I'm not suggesting that you go off and elect to take your child off dairy without supervision, but I'm just saying that is one of the things that can happen, where your child still has these sloppy poos that are not infectious, and it's not the gastro, but it can be very, very tricky to try and convince your daycare of that, or school. I guess it's more the daycare that sees the poos.
Yes, yeah, exactly. They definitely see it. And of course, that's where, getting that documentation from your doctor as well is really important. And other investigations may need to be done. So, but generally, if it's a simple gastro, that's gone through the family, then certainly here in New South Wales, it depends on where they're going. If it is a daycare, it's 24 hours. There are some other places where it is 48 hours. It depends on the state you're in. So
our daycare was 48 hours, yeah.
Yep, exactly. So make sure that you ask your daycare or school what their policy is. So that's really, really important. Now, Deb,
and also just to mention, sorry, with all of these lingering diarrheas, we can actually help children get over them sooner. So, and that's with things like they may need supplements like a probiotic. Sometimes it's zinc. Otherwise, as I said, it's manipulating their diet. So certainly things can be done, and it does not mean that your child needs to be off preschool for weeks on end.
Yeah, excellent. Good. Thank goodness. Now, the other thing we were going to talk about is rashes. And I've got a really good story. Can I tell it now, please?
Sure.
So when I went into labour with my second child, my youngest went with her grandparents for a little bit, and then went to to a family friend's house to stay for a couple of nights. And she had terrible mosquitoes where she was living. So my child got completely covered in mosquito bites. And the day I came home with my baby, which was a couple of days later, my husband took my daughter to daycare, and she was stopped at the door with a hand that said, "Stop, your child has chicken pox."
Chicken pox, I knew you were going to say that.
That's it. And my husband very calmly said, "No, they're mosquito bites." And bless this lovely daycare woman, she said, "I have seen chicken pox so many times in my life. That is chicken pox."
and he was like, "I'm a healthcare provider, qualified."
My husband said exactly that. "I'm a paediatric nurse. It's not chickenpox, believe me. And so they ended up saying, I'm sorry, but we're not going to take your daughter until we get a medical certificate. And my husband said, well, I'll be the one writing it, so it's up to you, which probably wasn't quite right because he's a nurse.
No, well, he would have been annoyed, right?
He was cranky. Yeah, he was definitely cranky. So they ended up taking it, and they were mosquito bites. But it can be really, really hard for a non-professional, a non-healthcare professional to see what a rash is. So it's incredibly hard for us as parents to know, what rashes are okay, what's not, and when do we have to keep our kids home? Can you shed any light on this one, please?
Look, there are a couple of rashes where we do need to keep our kids home, but the majority of rashes in children are harmless. They're associated with a viral infection, and they usually don't bother your child and go away on their own. The presence of a rash itself is not a sign of infectivity. And depending on the virus, it'll appear at different times of the illness. Like the classic one I think of is roseola, where they get these really high fevers, up to 40 degrees. And then, the next day the fevers have gone and this rash has come out, and that's kind of a classic pattern of one illness, just to mention it. But as I said, those kind of typical spotty, dotty, pink rashes that are pale, that go away, with pressure, those are what we call like those benign viral exanthems. The other rashes that are obviously a little bit more concerning are things like chickenpox, measles, and signs of bacterial infection or septicemia or allergies. So the sign, measles is a very typical rash, as is chickenpox, except for mosquito bites. And usually that is the diagnosis made clinically by your healthcare provider. The other ones that I mentioned, we're talking about very sick children with those bacterial infections and septicemia, and the rash is going to be the least of your reasons, in other words, for worrying. It's usually that your child is looking very unwell. The reason I mentioned urticaria is that, also known as hives, which is that allergic rash that is raised red, big blotches, perhaps pale in the center and very itchy. That can happen with allergies in terms of food exposures, medications, or environmental exposures, or even the cold, actually, and the heat and cold. But it can also happen with a viral infection. So that's why I just wanted to mention it. So it's actually probably the most common cause that we see of hives is a viral infection. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean your child is infective at the time, because often we'll see that rash, the week after, a couple of days to a week after your child has had the virus. So a rash in itself, other than those few, doesn't necessarily indicate infection, and shouldn't necessarily mean that your child has to stay home from school. I know that my kids had a funny little rash the other day. I sent them to school. I wasn't bothered by it because they didn't have any other symptoms. And what it was, I must be honest, I still don't know what it was. And sometimes we just don't, sometimes, and it's quite frustrating for me as a pediatrician when I get families coming and go, they've got this rash, and I'm like, well, it's not this, and this, which are the ones we worry about and the serious ones. So it kind of falls under that, as I said, that group of probably post-viral, probably they had something that we weren't aware of that they fought off, and this is just their body's way of expressing that.
Yep, absolutely. And that's important too. Thinking about, all of these things that wrap around that we always have to remember to look at our child as a whole, not just the individual things, of course. And I think another really important thing is that when you are seeking advice from your healthcare provider, make sure you ask the question, how long does my child need to stay home from school or daycare? So making sure that you ask that question, because sometimes, they may well forget to tell you. So it's a really, really important thing. But there are some great resources out there. And I'm just going to share my screen for a sec, because this is one of them. This is on Health Direct. So this is accessible, obviously Australia-wide and worldwide too, but this is Australian guidelines. You can download this information into a PDF, but it talks about how long you should keep your child home from school. So for chickenpox example, it says Yes, you need to keep them home until all the blisters have dried, which is usually around 5 days after the rash first appeared. So it's a great resource from colds to conjunctivitis to hand, foot and mouth disease and even head lice. And so I will put the link to this in the right down below there, so that in the comments, so that you can access this. And I'm just going to remove that so we can go
I'm
back
pretty
to
sure the
right
CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have exactly the same thing. I'm just quickly looking at it now.
Fantastic. Oh, good. So, yep, very, very good. So make sure that if you are in doubt, that you go and look at these resources. Ask your healthcare provider the question, how long do they need to stay home? And the other thing too that I think we should probably mention is that we think, okay, we need to stay home from school or daycare, but that also means that they need to not go up the shops with you. They shouldn't be visiting grandma in the nursing home. There's no play dates with friends. So it's that isolation period at home while they are infectious. So it's not just not going to school that's the important thing. It's keeping their germs to themselves. That's an important thing. So Deb, is there anything else you want to chat about before we finish up today? And if anybody has any questions, please, now is the time to type them in the comments below.
No, not that I can think of.
Good.
No, not that I can think of.
All good. And the other thing that, of course, we want to ask you is that you need to tell us what you want us to talk about. Please just pop it in the comments below or DM us. And remember, there is so much more good evidence-based information. Make sure you go to Deb's Instagram page at Dr Deb Levy, because there are so many resources and she's got a thing for infographics. Like, she's quite good at actually. Make sure you go have a look at those. And of course, following us at CPR Kids and having a look at our YouTube channel. So is there... No, I don't think there's any questions. So we're going to say goodbye. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back same time next week. See you, everyone.
Bye.